Hi, everybody. So today I thought we would look at some things that I have found in old books over the years, material that's often referred to as ephemera, that is, material that's not meant to have an ongoing purpose, but rather an immediate one. And they're just things that I have found in the pages of old books, forgotten apparently, placed in there for some purpose, but then never recovered. And I have an envelope full of the most interesting items, and I thought we could look at some of the most interesting examples right now. So we'll start with this, which is a very early Valentine's card. Best wishes to my Valentine, with a naked Cupid, and you can see the camera here. Obviously not a modern camera, but a camera nonetheless in a style that dates it to certainly the early 1900s, I would say. Let's say between 1895 and 1905, given that type of camera. On the back, you see postcard, and this script is typically late 19th century, early 20th century. It's very solid and apparently was never used. I'm not sure what that implies about the relationship, or if there was a relationship, and that's why this was stuffed in a book and forgotten, but it was pretty neat to find. Here's another postcard, and this is, as it says, the Custis Lee Mansion in Arlington, Virginia. Custis Lee referring to the residence of Robert E. Lee and his wife, whose maiden name was Custis. This is at the site of Arlington National Cemetery. In fact, as it says, Arlington, Virginia. It's referred to as Arlington House now, but General Robert Lee, who was the preeminent general of the Confederacy during the Civil War, married the granddaughter of George Washington, and this was her home, and Robert E. Lee moved into it. But after Lee took up a Confederate uniform, the North occupied his home, their home, and sort of confiscated it because it's right across the river from Washington. So the Union pretty quickly captured that and kept it. And then eventually, as kind of to embarrass Robert E. Lee, then turned his family home into a cemetery for Union dead, which is now a national cemetery. But in any event, this is a postcard from that house. And indeed, there is an explanation on the back, and certainly never used. This is also from the early 19th century. Another postcard, and this is, as it says, Washington's mansion in Mount Vernon. This is the home that is known as Mount Vernon. That is the residence of George Washington and his wife, Martha Custis. The two postcards were found in the same book, which is not surprising. Apparently, someone 115 years ago, roughly, went down to Virginia to visit some sites and picked up some postcards, but never sent them, just as mementos, I guess. And actually, interestingly, Not sure if this is legible here, but it is to me. It says, place the stamp here, 1 cent for United States and island possessions, Cuba, Canada, and Mexico, 2 cents. Well, United States and island possessions refers to, for example, the Philippines and Hawaii, and these were all taken, annexed, or brought into United States territories, or as United States territories, after the 1898 Spanish-American War. So we know that this is at least after 1898, but not too far after, I would say, given the style of writing. Well, about 60 or 70 years later, there is this, which I know may be hard to read, and rather than explain it, I will read it. It is from Richard Nixon. It's not personalized. This is not his handwriting. It's printed, but what it says is, your support for our efforts to bring the war in Vietnam to an end is deeply heartening, and I want you to know how much I appreciated your letting me know your views, or letting me have your views. While I regret that the great volume of messages makes it impossible for me to reply to you personally, it is a source of strength and encouragement to me that so many Americans have indicated that they do not dispute our basic aims in Vietnam, but share our overriding concern for achieving the peace with honor that all of us desire. Signed, Richard Nixon. There's nothing on the back, and clearly what this is a form letter to people who wrote to the president during his tenure in office prior to 1973, when the war in Vietnam was concluded, or at least when the treaty was signed that ended it. So this can be dated between 1969, when Nixon was inaugurated, and I would say, January 1973 is when the Paris Accords were signed, but it's surely earlier than that. But in any event, Nixon expanded the war in Vietnam. He never achieved peace with honor. The terms that were agreed to in Paris in 1973 were roughly the same terms that were being offered in 1968. So Nixon he has a dubious record when it comes to the war in Vietnam. But this was recovered in some book. It is not often that one finds the seal of the President of the United States in an old book, but that is what happened. Well, this is from it's clearly a newspaper clipping, and this is called Meditations of the Kaiser, referring to Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor of Germany during World War I. And these are poems, and this is dated 1914, 1916, 1918, the years of World War I. So we know that this is not before, or I should say this is sometime after 1918. On the back, we have an advertisement, something with a Delco light. Delco is, they produce the radios and some electronics for General Motors vehicles, for example, but this is when it was still an independent company. It's hard to say how old this is exactly, but given the topic, I would think that it would be in the year 1918 or shortly thereafter. World War I was concluded, because that's when it would have been pertinent. You can see a reference here to Kaiser Bill. That's what Wilhelm II was known as in his, or I should say, by his enemies. And then Uncle Sammy, referring to Uncle Sam or the United States, and aristocratic Johnny Bull, that's a reference to Great Britain. Here's a reference to, and as for submarines, oh dear, I don't know where they are, because his patent destroyers have sent them down so far. That reference is especially significant because the German Empire's practice of conducting unrestricted submarine warfare was what precipitated U.S. involvement in World War I, and which ultimately led to Germany's defeat, because it simply couldn't handle the overwhelming force of all of the Allies put together. Well, this is probably the oldest artifact, if you will, that I've recovered from a book. You can see the date right at the top, January 4th, 1877. Children's Department, Little Johnny's Thoughts. It's about Santa Claus. A Little School Ma'am. These are poems. It's a newspaper clipping, as you can see on the back, New York Weekly. This article is difficult to tell what the heck it's talking about or what the real context is of these poems, or what presumably the children's department was like a section of the paper where they put little poems, I suppose, but it's hard to know 139 years later what the deal was, but still nice to find. Well, this newspaper clipping has a date on it, which is March 1st, 1915. The newspaper is the Carbondale Leader, that is Carbondale, Pennsylvania, which is near Scranton in northeast Pennsylvania. It is coal country. And the article, as you can see, the late Dr. Alexander F. Gillis, Death Lays His Icy Hand on Kings. So this article is about this man, Alexander F. Gillis, but on the back, you can see the front page here. And the reason I selected this is because of this ad here, Where to Eat. Try our regular 35-cent dinner. Best in Carbondale. We can please the most fastidious. Our Sunday 50-cent turkey and chicken dinner can't be beat. Eatland Restaurant, corner of 6th and River. Why not try to win the Shetland pony and driving outfit? Well, why not indeed? And yes, I would very much like to try the regular 35-cent dinner. And, if possible, and I can budget for it, I would certainly enjoy the 50-cent turkey and chicken dinner. Of course, we can smile at these very low prices, but it's important to keep in mind that most people were earning only a couple dollars every day. I think the average monthly income, or I should say yearly income, around this time was perhaps around $1,000 a year. So 35 cents, certainly we can shake our couches and find more than that, but at the time, of course, it was much more. Well, this is a cutout of former President Calvin Coolidge's column. President Calvin Coolidge, who became president upon the death of Warren Harding in 1923 and then was elected in his own right in 1924, but left office in 1929, just 9 months before the stock market crash in October. But after he left office, he wrote a little column which, as you can see, is Calvin Coolidge Says. Dateline, Northampton, Massachusetts, January 7th. This would have been at the heart, or I should say at the apex of the Depression. And it's remarkable in a way because Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time the stock market crashed, was not responsible for it. He had only been in office a short time, so if anyone was to blame, it would have been the immediately preceding president, Calvin Coolidge. I'm not suggesting he was to blame, but an argument could be made. So when people are unemployed and standing in bread lines and selling apples for 10 cents and having no food and there's 25% unemployment, who cares what Calvin Coolidge says? But some people did, and he really was not particularly blamed for the Depression, but his motto was "the business of America is business," which meant unregulated capitalism for the most part, and based on what happened in the Depression, that turned out perhaps to be an insufficient policy. Well, now this is a hard to discern picture, perhaps especially on camera, but the caption, which is slightly cut off, is "Main altar in cathedral, decorated for Jubilee." And it's the inside of a Catholic cathedral. Now, on the back, you can see this picture. Philadelphia's fashion show, hats and gowns, opening of Paris. What? Paris fashion show? We don't know. But I did a little investigation, and certainly looking at the attire of these women, I found that there was a Catholic Church Jubilee year in 1900. The next one was not until 1925. And so this clipping is almost certainly, I would say absolutely, from the year 1900. Women were not wearing hats like this, were not dressed like this in 1925. So this is absolutely from 1900. It's too bad that there's not more of the back, but this is what we got of the Philadelphia fashion show, hats and gowns. Well, this is one of my favorites. You can see the date, October 28th, 1918. And this is sort of a poem, and it's about World War I. Now, the date, October 28th, is 2 weeks prior to the armistice of World War I, which was November 11th. So the war was about to come to an end. So there's this nice little poem, but that's not the reason I like it so much. The reason I like it, by the way, New York Herald, is because of these want ads on the back. And you will see that we have here help wanted females. Help wanted females, help wanted females. What you will find in newspapers of this era are separate sections for help wanted men and help wanted women. That is illegal in the United States now, and other places too, but certainly here it's illegal to request, let's just say, to separate classified advertisements by gender or sex. Cannot do that, but back then you could. And so, for example, here's one that says, government needs 12,000 women clerks. New York examinations, November 16th, December 7th, salary $1,200. Experience unnecessary. Women desiring government positions write for free particulars. J.C. Leonard, former civil service examiner, etc., Washington. Well, the government, the U.S. government, is advertising for women clerks. That would not be smiled upon right now. The reference to New York examinations with the dates refers to the civil service examinations, which became widespread in the 1880s. Prior to that, people were just appointed based on favoritism. The salary of $1,200 is quite good for this time. That's, of course, $1,200 a year. And again, women desiring government positions write for free particulars. That is, it's funny to read now. Here's another one for housework. Neat girl for housework and cooking, 3 adults. I'm sure that there are many people who would qualify for that today. Plenty of neat girls, and I'm sure back then as well. What else do we have? This one is government work again. Several young women required to train for position as automatic telegraph operators and handle telegrams by telephone. Weekly salary during training, immediate increase on graduation, rapid advancement to $93.50. Rest reliefs and cafeteria. Apply in person down on Canal Street and Broadway. Well, that's in Lower Manhattan. So what does that tell us? Again, of course, the solicitation for women only is ridiculous, although obviously common then. But want them to use telegraphs and telegrams by telephone. At this time, 1918, the telephone was only 42 years old, and the telegraph was less than 100 years old. But that was pretty advanced technology at the time. So we have advertisements for chambermaids, cooks. I mean, look at this. Cook, colored woman for plain cooking and housework in new apartment, where other maid is kept. Pleasant, light kitchen, $45. Are you out of your mind? Now, that $45 is $45 a month. Can you imagine advertising that? I mean, it's amazing it made sense at any time, but things were different. Here's another one. Chambermaid, waitress, Hungarian or Swedish, 3 in family. Why would you specify Hungarian or Swedish? Unless, of course, perhaps the family was Hungarian or Swedish. I'm not aware of any particular reputation for Hungarians or Swedes to be especially fastidious, although maybe they are. I'm not suggesting it's any less than average, but so what you have here is a microcosm of the United States in the early 20th century. Young Parisienne, visiting maid from 8 to 5 daily. Only one with first-class city references need apply. Excellent wages. So basically, that is a French woman who is willing to serve as a maid, but not for any riffraff. That is for sure. So I love this, not, of course, because I endorse it, but because it is an artifact of a lost world, and when people talk about or yearn for the past, they should remember that the past includes some unsavory elements, and I think that, in my opinion, specifying work requirements by gender or requesting colored women or Hungarians and Swedes to the exclusion of anyone else, I don't think that should be celebrated. But that is the way it was. Okay, well, might have spent too much time on that. This is a package of unused what am I trying to think of? Pharmaceutical labels. They're almost in brand new condition. Why are these in an old book? No one knows. But it's very interesting. So you see Phenobarbital tablets, which I understand phenobarbital is used primarily for the control of seizures related to epilepsy. Chocolate-coated tablets, rhinitis. Well, rhinitis is like hay fever or stuffy nose, that sort of thing, inflammation of the nasal passages. I see quinine sulfate. Quinine was the cure for malaria, which comes from tree bark. I don't know that there are any chocolate-covered rhinitis tablets now. Oh my goodness. Well, here we have gonorrhea, which is interesting because one can see in the news concerns about a modern strain of gonorrhea being apparently resistant to modern medications. Some things do not change. Yeah, gonorrhea is special, that is for sure. I don't know, I'm not a pharmacist, what all these things do, although I do know this. Strychnine is included in rat poison. Do not ingest strychnine. Now, at the time, it was widely used in medications for various things. I think for coughs, I think as an anti-inflammatory. I'm not 100% sure, but that's what I recall. But strychnine is definitely used in rat poisons too. Don't eat that. I do not know when these were produced, but it's worth noting that it was in 1906 that the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed as part of the initial progressive reforms. And part of that act was to basically get the crap out of food and drugs and to label things with ingredients and to get rid of quack medicine. And I don't know whether strychnine was one of those ingredients that was removed because it was determined to be too poisonous, but it certainly, you would think, should have been. Obviously, this is from Morris Drug Company in York, Pennsylvania, which is east central southern Pennsylvania. I love this. Laxative tablets, aromatic. Okay. Belladonna, that rings a bell. No pun intended. I want to say, I believe that's a poisonous plant. I'm almost certain that it is, but I don't remember exactly. I'm sure it is. More phenobarbital. Oh, these look like. Oh, here's aspirin. More rhinitis. Oh, well, all right. Arsenic, poison for technical use. Well, thanks. That is ominous enough for me not to have arsenic. Arsenic, however, was used in the 19th century by women to lighten their skin. At that time, pale skin, and of course I'm talking about sort of among white upper class, or at least middle and upper class American women, pale skin was considered a sign of wealth, because it meant that you stayed indoors. That is to say, if you got a tan, it meant that you must be outside a lot, which means you must be working outside, which means you couldn't afford to stay inside. You had to work rather than stay indoors. And so women would sometimes ingest arsenic because it would lighten the skin. And of course, if you miscalculated the dosage that you took, you could certainly die. And then finally, quinine. I have no idea whether that is meant or not meant, but whether that label here refers to pills for malaria. Like I said, quinine is the cure for that, but maybe it was. All right. Put those away in a bit. Whoops. Well, this is a comic strip, which I won't read, but it is a dialogue among 3 World War I soldiers. And so this is between 1917 and 18, or it's either one or the other, and I would guess 1918, because that's when most U.S. soldiers got overseas. Now on the back, sometimes the back is more interesting than the front, but we see a reference to suffragettes who were, I think, sent to Washington jail to press damage suits. Suffragettes, of course, were women who were advocating for the vote, which was granted in 1919, so that the first election for president, at least, that women could vote was 1920, which they did. And then we see here, Chinese weather prophet has been jailed in California on a charge of running a lottery. Well, how dare he? Debts to wife and other members of family paid in Flushing court by Corona man, who granted judge as witness, quote, so they can't come back and say I didn't pay them. This was a lot of drama, I should say. So, 2,000 seagulls have been calling regularly all winter at Muskegon, Michigan hotel for their noon meal. Like, I just, I like the idea of 100 years ago eating breakfast and reading about 2,000 seagulls waiting to eat at Muskegon, Michigan. And there was World War I happening at the same time. Well, you can see the date of this clipping, November 26, 1918. This was 15 days after the armistice ending World War I. And what's significant about this is you see this poem here called The Goose Step by B.H. Nadal, a name that is not familiar to me. If he or she was a famous poet, I don't know it. Didn't mean to rhyme like that, but there we have it. Anyway, here's the devil, and here is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who is naked with a chain around his neck and wearing the Prussian helmet, and he is chained to what is represented as the monstrous Hun, who has a iron cross, the German military decoration, strapped to his tail. American and British propaganda frequently depicted the nation of Germany as kind of this strange furry creature. who does not look very ominous, but there's no denying the barbarity of war. But these two are chained together, and of course, again, this is just after the German defeat. I will just point out that on the back here we have another help wanted, which I will not go through in great detail as I did before, but I will just point out that we have here help wanted females, and here situations wanted males. We have here Japanese people. These are people requesting work. We have here man, colored, 36, strong and ambitious, wishes position, $18 per week or more, willing to do anything. Well, that is that sentiment would find a lot of resonance today too, in the economy that we have, which presumably is growing, but it is hard to feel. But again, it is extremely jarring to have someone identify himself as colored in an ad. But it was necessary to do that because if that gentleman showed up the wrong color, so to speak, he very likely could have been turned away. So it's best to put those pertinent details out there. But that's not something that we should look on fondly, obviously. But these are very, very interesting to look at least to me. This is a clipping which actually is dated October 13th, 1924 by whoever squirreled it away in a book regarding the sinking of the U.S. battleship Washington. You see here the target fire of the U.S. battleship Washington. So they were going to use this ship as target practice, and people were opposed to that. You know, people who may have sailed on that ship or had fond memories of it otherwise would not have been pleased to see it used as target practice, and so they got an injunction. But on the back is what I really wanted to show you, which is in 1924 you could get this fine cut velour living room suite. Usual price $190, yours for only $159.85. But again, keep in mind, I don't know why I flipped it. Keep in mind that the classified ads were people looking for work for $18 a week or maybe $30 a week. So $159 was, a goodly portion of an average person's annual salary, certainly monthly salary. All right. This is Washington's Prayer. It is not dated. I have no idea how old it is, but I thought it was interesting because someone took the time to type up what he or she discovered was George Washington's prayer. I've never heard of it. George Washington was not a traditional Christian. You'll see that he's referring to the divine author of our blessed religion. George Washington was considered a Unitarian, which roughly described would be someone who believed that the universe is like a giant clock which God built and then wound it up, and then the universe goes on its own without a lot of intervention from above, so to speak. And normally, Unitarianism is not defined by a particular devotion to Jesus, the Christian Savior, but we can see that there is absolutely a reference to that there. So this would seem to be a more traditional type of prayer for Washington, a more Christian prayer than is usually attributed to him. But we also don't know, or at least I don't know, sitting here, when Washington typically said this prayer. Was it as a young man, or was it when he was older? The answer may be out there, but it's not right here. But it's interesting what strikes people as worthy enough to take the time and note. Well, here is one of my favorites. These are a student's homework from March 31st, 1919 and April 2nd, 1919. And the student is Leo Ryan. And this is Mr. Ryan's Greek homework and Latin homework. You will see the teacher made some notations, some corrections presumably, and wrote at the bottom, good L, as in good Leo. I found these papers in what would be considered now a middle school book, middle school history textbook. So I believe that Leo was probably about 13 years old, 12 or 13 years old, and it was by no means uncommon for students at this time to be learning Greek and Latin at that age. That is most certainly not the case now. I'm not suggesting that it ought to be, but there is reason to believe that the requirements from 100 years ago were a bit more rigorous than perhaps they are now. That is not a fault of the students, of course, but I should think of society whose standards have been lowered. Nevertheless, this is not something that we would see today, at least not around here. But it is very impressive, very impressive. I cannot comment on what is written here because I don't know what it is saying, although I do see the word Caesar there. And that may be the word Roman, but I think that's the word Greece. I don't know. I think it is, but I will think that Leo's teacher must have done a good job, but I cannot verify that. Oh well, this is I like this. This is Yale College Semi-Annual Examination from June 1909 for History B29 Modern Asiatic. So this is like a midterm exam from June 1909. I really like I think this is a extremely impressive exam. 9 open-ended questions that one absolutely would need to have a pretty good amount of knowledge in order to answer properly. I mean, some of these are not too difficult, so to speak. Causes of the war between Japan and Russia, which is to say the 1905 conflict. outlined the Portsmouth Treaty. That's what ended that, for which Theodore Roosevelt, who mediated that dispute, received a Nobel Peace Prize. But some of these, I mean, obviously, I didn't take History B29, but the point is, the Russian conquest of Khiva, character of the Trans-Caspian region, and the nature of Russian rule there. I could not begin to comment on that at all. I don't know what Khiva is, and I'm embarrassed to say that. I maybe it's something that is rather important even today, but I do not know what that is at all. And then this Nobunaga. I know Buddhism and Christianity, obviously, but Nobunaga? I don't know what that is. I don't know what Yoritomo is. Again, I didn't take this class, and so none of us should feel too badly, but I'm just impressed at the specificity of some of these questions. I recognize that if you've taken the course, you should be able to answer them, but I do feel that in a modern class, perhaps at Yale or anywhere else, I imagine that the general public would at least be able to understand all the words in the questions of a modern midterm exam. That is not the case here, or at least not this one with me. I guess this was kept as a memento. Whether as a positive or a negative one, I do not know. Well, this is not particularly old, but the reason I wanted to show this to you is because this is, as you can see, it's a syllabus for History 1, and this was at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia. But these two artifacts are related. They were both found in the same book, and this is a receipt for the Temple University bookstore. You will see here $12.95, plus tax of 5 cents. And this was for this textbook. And I bring this out, and this is from the late 1960s. So again, not particularly old, but $12.95 for a textbook. I do not have to explain to everybody, because some of you know firsthand, that these days the numbers would be the same for a textbook, but the decimal point would have to be moved over to the right of the 9. It is absolutely outrageous and abusive what the prices of textbooks are these days. It is contemptible what students have to pay for learning materials. That is my opinion. Again, $12.95 was more money then than it is now, but I think it's fair to say that the price of textbooks has far outpaced the normal rate of inflation. So that is my screed on that. Speaking of Greek and Latin, is a worksheet that is in Greek and Latin. I have no context for it. I don't know when it is from, although, again, I think the late 60s, only because of the book that it came from. I have no idea. Well, I can't read this. I'm assuming that this and this say the same thing, but we can see here this is a reference to Joseph of Galilee from the city of Nazareth in Judea, the city of David. I'm not suggesting here that I can read Latin. It's just that it seems evident enough what this is saying. I mean, I can clearly that's Nazareth, right? So it's about biblical history. Here we have Christus Dominus, right? Christ the Lord from the city of David. So the education of Greek and Latin and the classics persisted for quite some time, but it is pretty non-existent now, which I think is not that great. I think that there is a lot of insight to be gained from studying ancient languages, especially Latin being the progenitor of the Romance languages, etc. And of course, so much of Western heritage is based on Greek thought. So I think that we're at a loss for not studying that. Now this is something. Obviously it's something, but... Well, so what this is, these papers, well, let's just go through it. So we have here, this is a syllabus for Modern China, winter semester 1974. I don't know what university, but this student took these papers and went to China and to Japan. Whoops. And that is evident because this is I suppose it's like a brochure of the exhibition of Ming porcelains at the National Palace Museum. And this is a little clipping showing Chinese dynasties. On the back we have the National Palace Museum. I should very importantly clarify that I said that this person visited China. Well, you see, Republic of China, that is not mainland China, but it is what is Taiwan, off the coast of China, not quote-unquote Red China. That was how it was looked at the time, communist to Red China. So to revise my statement more accurately, this student went to Taiwan, which was referred to as the Republic of China because that is where the so-called Republicans in China, non-communists, if you will, they fled mainland China after the victory of Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War, and they established the government in exile on Taiwan, which was recognized by the United States as the official government of Taiwan, or excuse me, of China, until soon after Nixon visited China in 1972. It's quite a story, but bottom line here is that this was Taiwan. But this, which is on extremely thin paper, very, very thin paper, is stamped Japan. This is not very good here. Excuse me. Okay. Receipt for registered article. This is stamped Japan, and that's 12/10/74. So December 10th. Well, sticking to me, 1974. I cannot read this, and that is because it is in Portuguese, and that is Brazil right there. This looks like a name which I cannot read, or at least I'm not sure of what it says. But in any event, this student also visited Japan and had some registered article. I don't know what it was, but anyway, this student clearly took his or her course in modern China extremely seriously, although since this is winter 1974 and this is dated December 1974, I wonder whether it was a very extensive field trip, which would have been pretty impressive. Not many students go on field trips to East Asia these days, but that would have been pretty interesting, I would think. So that's one of the more exotic finds. And this one is not particularly remarkable, but the reason I'm showing it is because for anyone who is of a certain age, like me, this is how our worksheets in high school looked all the time. Handwritten and duplicated on a rotating ditto machine. Does anyone else remember those? People had copy machines, Xeroxes, etc., but they were often not used because they were expensive to operate. And so our teachers, at least in my own experience, they would have their handwritten worksheets and physically rotate a purple printing machine and make these copies. And they would oftentimes be worksheets that were prepared decades earlier. I can say that I had a teacher who taught for 30 years before he died, and he was using worksheets from the 1950s in the 1980s. But I guess if you're doing a worksheet on the Byzantine Empire from the 7th century, then you can still have a worksheet that's good for 30 years after. But anyway, this just brought back a lot of memories for me to see this, because one does not see that now. Well, finally, extremely coincidentally, finally we have a final exam for History 40, which I think this was at Harvard, and I'm remembering that from the book that I took it from. But this is from, as you can see, the spring of 1968, and the reason that I am showing you this is this. What have you learned in History 40 which helps you to understand the current problems facing America? Well, that is extremely interesting, at least to me, because this is an effort of the teacher to try to apply history to modern problems. That in itself, I think, is significant. Not often, it doesn't happen that often, but it's significant also because the spring of 1968 was probably one of the worst periods in modern U.S. history. The spring of 1968 included the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th. Only days before that, on March 30th, President Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not be running for re-election, which everyone expected him to do, and that was because of the war in Vietnam, making his presidency completely untenable. Only a few months prior to that, in January the 30th, or perhaps the 31st, was the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which was a massive offensive campaign by the Viet Cong and took the American forces completely off guard. And even though they were beaten back, that is, the Viet Cong were, it showed Americans and the world that American suggestions that the war in Vietnam was being won were completely illusory, if not fabricated. So, and then only months after the spring, the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy, who was running for president on June 4th. Point being, the spring of 1968 was a particularly horrifying time. And so when you look at, William Seward, Theodore Weld, Jay's Treaty, it's easy and in many ways understandable to think, who, in the name of all that is sacred, cares about what happened 150 years ago when Martin Luther King is being assassinated and thousands of American soldiers are being killed every month in Vietnam? What difference does it make? Well, this professor was clearly cognizant of that question and is trying to apply history to modern problems. And I think that there's certainly a compelling argument that history does help us understand the present. So I agree with the professor, but sometimes it is difficult to see how things from a long time ago are applicable, but honestly, normally they are. And again, I like the open-ended nature of these questions, because really you can't evaluate someone's learning with true and false questions or multiple choice. In order to find out whether someone has been educated by your course, I think you'd want to have some exposition that shows the students can reason and incorporate relevant facts, etc. And that is what this professor thought too. Well, there is one more thing. Last thing. This is a candy wrapper, a foil candy wrapper from Lowney's Chocolates. And I realize that for all intents and purposes, it is trash. I will not deny that, but it was pressed in a book for 100 years, and it wrapped up like a little candy bar. Lowney's was a chocolate manufacturer akin to Hershey's chocolate in the United States or Cadbury chocolate in Europe. But they don't exist anymore. And I don't know why. In any way, I have no idea why this was pressed in a book. Maybe it was the last candy bar someone ate before they lost their teeth or something. I don't know. But it was found in this book, the Lowney's Cookbook, which is from 1908. So this would be, again, not to belabor the point, but if Hershey's put together a cookbook, that's what this would be. I don't know that Hershey's has a cookbook, but Lowney's did, and Maria Willett Howard put this together, and it's a pretty significant recipe book. There are lots of pretty delicious stuff in here, I must say, and what you find, and this is not unexpected, but when recipes call for chocolate, they call for, well, here, look, it's funny, but orange chocolate sauce, 4 tablespoons of Lowney's premium chocolate grated. But I have to say, I've been tempted to try some of these recipes because some of them are quite good. What is a little bit shocking, though, is the extent to which lard is called for in the recipe. Lard is fat. It's animal fat. In fact, look, chicken fat. Maybe you can go and get chicken fat at a grocery store. I guess. I don't know. I don't have need for that in my own household. Oh, but see, nice color plates in here, which was not particularly common in books of this era. Chocolate souffle, vanilla ice cream with chocolate sauce in a nice china cup there. Here's a recipe for plain ice cream. But you see, you make the plain ice cream. You do not go out and get the ice cream. But here in the back, the way back, you see this was what Lowney's was all about. Here's Lowney's cocoa, breakfast cocoa. And this is a Lowney's chocolate bar, like a baking chocolate, I suppose. I believe Lowney's went out of business in the 50s, but don't quite recall. Lowney's Always Ready sweet cocoa powder. And you see, I guess that's Mrs. Lowney there. But they were a big deal, Lowney's was, back in the day. My understanding is that their chocolate is good for school lunches, picnics, and after meals. Lowney's milk chocolate is a delicious confection and a most nourishing food. It is made of pure chocolate, the finest cream from our own herd of blooded Jersey cows, and pure vanilla, sweetened with the best granulated sugar, powdered in our own factory. Now, if that does not make you want a Lowney's milk chocolate bar, what would? I would like one right now. I want to be able to taste the cow in my chocolate bar. But apparently, eventually, not enough people thought that way, and Lowney's disappeared. But here is an artifact of that, this candy wrapper, which contained a delicious, delicious Lowney's piece of candy. And so, with that sweet ending, I will leave it here. Thank you for looking at those things with me. I hope you enjoyed it. And see you next time.